what I began to notice was a very clear distinction between craft and art. And I think there's a time and place for both. But in realizing that distinction, some things got easier, some things got harder. Writing library tracks got much easier because, oh, wait a second, I don't have to do anything artful with this. It's all craft. I know exactly what I needed to do. And with Master Chef, there are 11 seasons prior to this that already have an established sound. So I just follow what I need to do. That's an exploration in craft. But in working on craft like that every day, what slowly started to become harder was the artistic approach, or at least leaning towards the artistic approach, which I would say is, the writing for picture, the prescriptive writing for picture. You almost stop thinking of it artistically.
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. Hey everybody, how's it going? And welcome to another edition of the podcast. Tyler here, and I don't want to waste no time today. I want to jump straight into the episode. This is part 2 of my conversation with film composer Austin Hammonds. So if this is your first time listening, please jump back to last week's episode to make sure you get to hear this entire conversation. In the last episode, we left off with Austin sharing his thoughts on the role of taste in his work as a composer and having a chance to revisit some compositions after stepping away from it for some time. Today's episode continues with some of my usual questions for guests, and Austin dives deeper into what craft and artistry mean to him. So one of the questions that I ask everybody that I talk to is, what would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative practice? So that could be like aesthetics, style, philosophy, anything of that sort of nature.
It's such a good question. It's a tough one. Something that's very important to me, and I've been talking about this with some of my contemporaries recently, is the orchestra, of course. And I think a lot of young composers, say that because it's the best, it's the biggest, it's why I bring that up. And I mentioned this to a friend of mine, an agent friend of mine. I think the orchestra in the Western classical form, because I think it is important to bring that up, the orchestra is one of the apexes of creative community expression. And I guess what I mean by that is, I think in a lot of cultures, a lot of people show up to witness or watch a lot of people doing something. And of course, we have similar things in Western culture as well. But what I'll say with the orchestra is there's so much history in every one of the instruments. There's so much history in every one of the people. When you go to a concert and you sit down and you listen to an orchestra, you're listening to the experiences of 80 to 100 people,
right,
performing the same piece. We've all heard what gets programmed. If I want to listen to Dvorak, I can pull it up on Spotify, and I'll get the same exact performance every time. But when you go to a concert, you're going because you want to hear how that select group of people and that conductor bring their impression of what that piece should sound like. And I guess to further go into the weeds, the principal horn player is sitting there playing Dvorak, but having practiced countless hours of all of these other works in order to be good enough to be on that stage at that time doing that thing. So it's this culminative experience of experiences. You get an audience of hundreds of people showing up to listen to 100 people share this moment in time that's temporary, and then it gets recorded and you can listen to it over and over and over again. But I think why I choose to go with that is because when I think about the orchestra in the context of film music in the US, and why it is a pillar for me, is that I think it is a truly timeless sound. I don't think it's something that is going to get old. It's something that in a way has climaxed. It has had its heyday, both outside of film, in film. Now we're on to synth scores, and of course the pendulum always swings, and we're certainly
Right.
swinging back from Hans and Johann Johansson, and these very, there will always be those kind of super unique synth artists, but there's a lot more orchestra maybe nowadays than there used to be, or maybe there is, but it is in a different context than what it used to be. I guess what I'm meaning to say is there's something very timeless about the sound of the orchestra, and at the same time the act of working with an orchestra is so deeply rooted in how much the expression of time that every person has spent in their respective instrument to come together to do something for you. And there's something that is so, so beautiful about that. And I think it will always be something that it's a core, fundamental pillar for me, just because the process is incredible. And the first time I experienced it, I guess in a proper way, we talked about reading through a piece of my music or arrangements and that kind of thing. I remember it was the end of my start of my sophomore year in college, and we played a piece of mine for the first time. It was a piece called Travels. I'll release it at some point. It's been 10 years at this point, but I don't know. It was a wind band exploration piece, and that was the first time I had ever conducted a composition of my own with a large ensemble. And I'd put together the players, and we were doing a rehearsal because, again, there was no composition program. So I kind of had to do everything myself at that time. That was when I kind of realized and recognized, I guess, the power of what it is that we were all doing together that
Yeah.
day. I sat by myself in a box, wrote a piece of music. I presented it to a bunch of musicians. They brought their experience and made something of what I had, in my own selfish process, made. But while my process of sitting by myself and working at a computer, part of the fun of it is realizing when you're writing a horn line for a director's first feature that may not go anywhere, when you're writing something for that, you're still thinking in your head, oh, well, how would Strauss write this line? Because I know Strauss is a very important to the repertoire of horn players, or well, if I'm writing these trombones, like how would Wagner voice these chords? Like it's all it sounds so ridiculous, or like I'm putting myself on some sort of pedestal. And it's almost the exact opposite. I have so much respect for everything that has come before me that anything that I want to make, I try to pay it that same amount of respect, even if the quality of what I'm working on isn't necessarily, some may say, deserving of that. And I think that's something so beautiful about the orchestra. So stylistically, certainly that is it. A focus on orchestration, which I guess I should maybe clarify for the viewers. In the field of film music, there's so many different terms and jobs and all of that kind of stuff. A composer writes the music. An orchestrator, or orchestration, the study of or the practice of, I guess, in our field, is the person who takes the notes that the composer is writing and just sets it to the orchestra. Now, depending on the era of time, this could be a very creative field, which oftentimes today it is. So you write a sketch and then they really write the cue for you. Or in the olden days, you write a full blown, 8-part staves. John Williams sketches are a really good example of this. And then there's really, like, you say, oh, I want to double the horns here. Let's split the woodwinds at this mark. Let's give this to the oboes, blah, 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 blah. You write out every single note. And then the orchestrator's job is literally just to put that from an 8-part sketch and blow it up to the individual parts. So when I say orchestration is something that I'm passionate about, it is as a composer who likes to focus on orchestration during the writing process as opposed to
Mm,
leaving that to somebody else after. I think rhythm and culture is a really interesting one. And I mean, I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up. I think identity as a composer who happens to be black is interesting because I don't necessarily consider that as a core pillar, but it's something that I can't necessarily ignore, if that
yeah.
makes any sense. Rhythm is something I always love. It's something that I always have like played with, and I enjoy it. Not necessarily because nobody is doing it, but I mean a prime example of this actually is John Williams music for Star Wars. Generally speaking, most of it uses a very standard orchestral percussion setup,
Right.
brass snare, cymbals, timpani, suspended cymbal, piatti, whatever. But then you look at the score for Solo, which also was Star Wars and was John Powell, and he's using a very, very extended percussion. And in some cases, it's the same exact tracks, but just with a very robust percussion section. Sounds completely different. So the addition of rhythm to things, I think, is something that I enjoy. It doesn't belong in everything, but it's something I'm kind of excited to explore more in the future. Not necessarily as it pertains to race or identity, but realizing that in saying, this is something I can't really ignore, a lot of the music that I was brought up with, culturally speaking, I think is very rhythmically focused. So it's a fun thing to kind of experiment with in the setting of that being a pillar. But I think another thing that is very important to me, not necessarily just the what, but also the why.
Mm,
As I mentioned with the whole orchestra thing, I mean, orchestra is great. That's the what. It sounds cool. That's the what. But the why, I think, is so important. And maybe of all of the pillars, and some of my friends and contemporaries in my field give me some crap about I get a little too heady and existential. But I mean, I think it's valid. I care very deeply about what we do, and it is truly just music. It's just music. We're not saving lives. A lot of people say that, and I agree with it to a point. But there's something wholly important in its own way about what we do, simply because it's almost like we are emotional shepherds. Somebody will come to you to listen to something, to maybe get over a breakup, or to get over this, or to get over that, or to help them process this. They might just listen to your music just to forget about something. They might listen to your music to feel nothing. So it's almost our job to help people through the everyday in some way or another, and a lot of times not the ways that we might intend.
mm,
Once you create something, it's going to be devoured and enjoyed in its own way. Probably not the intention of that. And artist and intent is a whole nother conversation that I have my feelings about. But absolutely, one of my core pillars is just like caring deeply about what we do and the people that I get to do it with. You know, treat people well. It's not a foreign concept, but I think in an industry that sometimes is wrought with not the best people in mind, either ahead of you, under you, wherever, sideways. I think it's increasingly important to just be a good person, to reach a helping hand backwards. And in the same way of what I was talking about with the orchestra thing, I mean, I think it's a community. I think art in and of itself kind of is a community
yeah.
pursuit. It's a community that builds itself, that kind of respects itself, that demands and asks for respect at times when it should be. But yeah, I mean, I do get a bit existential about this, and I haven't even completely formed my own answer to the pillars thing. So I think you're kind of seeing me process it in real time, which may be why it's so broken and discombobulated.
Well, you've mentioned a time or two like this, I guess, concept of craft versus artistry. I mean, where does
Yeah.
that fit into all of
Uh,
this?
Oh, here we go. So recently, it has to be prefaced, so this might be a long one. When I was working at Bleeding Fingers, there were three things that company does. You do, as I describe it, there's library work, there's work for picture, and work to picture. Essentially, what that means is library work. You write a track, it's 3 minutes long, it has good edit points, it has a mood, a general mood. It sounds like something. It's never some sort of new idea, but it makes money because it sits in a library, and then Google wants to use it for an ad, and you get a few $100 in royalties.
Yeah.
Wonderful. It's great. There's music for picture, which is, let's say, and this happens a lot, and it happened a lot. Master Chef is doing a new season. Let's say season 12, I think I worked on. So they put in an order with Bleeding Fingers for 200 tracks. They bill Bleeding Fingers. Bleeding Fingers pays us our salary, and the whole company of around 20 composers or so will write a few tracks each, maybe two or three each, to fill out this order over X amount of time. That's kind of music specifically for something, but really it still is just a library. You're not writing to picture. There's no dramatic process here, really. And then there's writing music for picture, which is the proper, you're sitting down with the scene trying to figure out and write something. Okay, like this person's doing this. Do I want to Mickey Mouse this, which is kind of matching what's to picture? It's a term that calls back early animation of Disney. Or do I just kind of want to ride underneath this? Like, how am I going to process this? What am I going to do? What does this sound like? Well, what does the director want? Like, it's that whole looking at the screen and figuring out very prescriptive
Mm.
Creation. And so, having done so much of all three of those things, less so of music for picture, because I didn't do a lot of those track orders, thankfully. What I began to notice was a very clear distinction between craft and art. And I think there's a time and place for both. But in realizing that distinction, some things got easier, some things got harder. So writing library tracks got much easier because, oh, wait a second, I don't have to do anything artful with this. It's all craft. I know exactly what I needed to do. And with Master Chef, there are 11 seasons prior to this that already have an established sound. So I just follow what I need to do. That's an exploration in craft. But in working on craft like that every day, what slowly started to become harder was the artistic approach, or at least leaning towards the artistic approach, which I would say is, the writing for picture, the prescriptive writing for picture. You almost stop thinking of it artistically, and you start thinking of it from a craft perspective. Now, we'll come back to this. I think that is a good thing, but at the time, I was terrified by it because I was like, well, no, as a young composer, I was 24. I mean, I'm still young, but at 24, I was like, no, I need to have a unique voice. And everybody in school told me that I need to be different, and I need to have this, and I need to have that. And this is my identity. And I have to establish myself as an artist. I'm coming to realize that I just think that's bullshit.
Yeah.
For just to be kind of uncouth, I think is the right terminology there. I really do. I just think it's bullshit because what I've seen happen, and this is now the return to what I said we'll come back to later. What I've seen happen in the past 10 or so years, in my industry specifically, is kind of the post Hans era. Hans was kind of an artist when he got into the industry. And around the same time, 80s, 90s, artists started coming onto the scene for film scoring. And when I say coming onto the scene, I also should give a little disclaimer here, historically speaking. There were multiple waves of film composers that came into Hollywood. You have the immigrants, and before the immigrating composers who were coming here to escape XYZ in their own country, they were composers in their own right. They're coming here to explore film and that kind of thing as composers. After that, it was like two generations of that before you got the actual like American composers like the John Williams and the Jerry Goldsmith and the like. And I think it took some time for American composers to get a root in that. And shortly after that, then you have the short little jazz era John Williams also is kind of a part. I mean, he's 93, so he's been a part of so much of the history of film, which is part of the reason why he's so great, one of the best. So you go from these illustrious scores that are representative of the music of these other cultures, these immigrants who are coming in, Nina Rota and these big grand, all of this kind of stuff. Then you get these American scores, which are these uniquely not quite jazz, but of something else, if I may say that. I mean, I think American culture, what is so beautiful about it is that it is kind of a melting pot, and it takes from all of these other different cultures and creates something new out of it. And then you have jazz, and then you have 80s, you get into the synth scores and all this kind of stuff. So you can kind of see that there's a push towards artistry anyway, that is natural of American music, and certainly what we appreciate. So when you look at it from that perspective, you get into the 80s, and these artists start to come onto the scene. So then people start hiring artists. Now, artists have worked on their craft and have become artists and explored their voice before they're discovered. It's not like, oh, we're going to find this artist and turn them into an artist. It's like, no, you're hiring the artist because you want what they've already been doing, you know. And so much of what they've already been doing also is honing their craft so that they have a unique voice, or chasing after a unique voice so hard that it develops into this beautiful, this art, this brand new thing that hasn't really existed, but it is so full of craft in and of its own right. I mean, Jacob Collier is a great example of that. He's an artist who is so craftful, maybe not in the standard way of doing it. I was just watching a TikTok or an Instagram reel of him recording with a trumpet player, and he's literally just singing the pitch that he wants the trumpet player to play. He's not writing parts. And then he layers everything over itself, and it is a beautiful, complex chord that he could have written out, but he did it faster, and he
Yeah.
did it in his own way. That's a completely different craft, but he's an artist. So I guess where I'm getting with this is film music started hiring artists in the most recent years, and in hiring artists, in some cases, hiring artists to do a craft form, which we've kind of established in our previous conversations, which is coming in to lay down carpet. It's a process. That's difficult because the artist kind of wants to do what they want to do, but you're in an industry that doesn't always support that. And certainly in a job, being a film composer, that doesn't always support that. So in a lot of times they need a lot of help. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a different process. But yeah, so you see a lot of very artistic composers who come onto the scene. They might have been rockers or guitarists or that kind of thing, who come onto the scene because, oh, we're really looking for, like, let's say, a rock guitar artist. Well, a rock guitar artist might not know how to orchestrate.
Yeah.
So they do need to bring on an orchestrator, and that orchestrator needs to have a team because of the amount of work well, they might not know how to deliver stems for something. That might be the first time they've ever heard of stems. Well, you're going to need an assistant, you're going to need this, and you're going to need that. So you start seeing these teams develop around artists, which is
Mm.
beautiful. And it's a completely different way that things used to be done. Talking with an older composer that I know who owns the studio that I work out of in Burbank, he was like, yeah, I mean, when Hans came on the scene, he created an entire little, almost like industry, brand new way to do this job, which is having a team and leaning on that team respectfully to help them get your product shipped. And you are the head of the ship who's just pointing it in the right direction, creatively as well. I mean, Hans's ideas are wonderful. So now let's go back to the beginning of this question that you asked. When I was at Bleeding Fingers and I was realizing this and experiencing it in real time, when I was in remote control and seeing this kind of machine that Hans had made, no disrespect, that was not at all what I wanted to do. I wanted to be somebody who was a craftsman, who was kind of in control of my craft. And if I may go further, without disrespecting true maestros, and this is kind of a soapbox. I think my goal, or what I could hope to aspire to be, is a modicum of the maestro that somebody like Leonard Bernstein or John Williams became. And not in a way that I want to be John Williams, I want to be Leonard Bernstein, but in a way that they were, calling back to our previous conversation, in complete control of every aspect of what they were doing. When Leonard Bernstein got up to conduct, I mean, yearly I will watch him rehearse the recording, I believe, of the soundtrack release for West Side Story. And it's fascinating to watch him work. And when I see him working, it's not working out of question. It's not working because he's repeating something that somebody on his team said, "Hey, you should do this." It's him working because he studied these scores. It's him working because he studied conducting. He is a master at every corner of the craft that is creation, and not only creation, but also bringing execution, bringing that to life. I want to be somebody who isn't afraid to get up in front of an ensemble and rehearse that ensemble with my music, because I know every note of what I've written, of what I've orchestrated. Now, I also want to conduct the ensemble, rehearse the ensemble. I want to be able to have a conversation with the mixer. And now this begets a different conversation. What does it mean to be a craftsman and or maestro, quote unquote, in the common era? Well, that does look different following the way that Hans has kind of revolutionized this industry, because you do still have to have a team. There are expectations now that are completely different than what they were 40, 50 years ago. I mean, let alone 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Because the industry now for 10, 15, 20 years has gotten so used to people having a team that can turn things around very quickly. You've always written an episode of TV a week. So, 30, 40 minutes of music of a week. But because the tech has changed, there's so many more people involved now. You can't mix everything yourself. You don't always have the money to just go to a stage and record the score and, okay, everything's taken care of for me. You do have to have a team. So to me, the definition of maestro has shifted a little bit, in that it also includes being able to have a conversation with your mixer about what you might want from an EQ perspective, from a saturation perspective. Now, not getting in the way of what they're doing. They still need to be able to do their job, but knowing enough about what it is that you're putting your hands into to be able to know what you're asking for. And that is what I see when I see the maestro, John Williams. When I see them work, is they know how to communicate with everybody involved on their team and or otherwise to be able to get the desired thing as the final result. And when it comes to the art and craft conversation, now the direct answer to your question, what I see currently and what I have seen of the past is most of the best artists that I know, film music, contemporary music, visual art, dance art, whatever, are incredible craftsmen. Incredible craftsmen. Now, whether or not that comes from the process that we kind of distinguish between whether they were artists first and then got really good at whatever craft they were and redefined the craft, Jacob Collier, or whether they studied and practiced the craft to the best of their ability and took that and ran with it, John Williams. That's what I see, and that's what I have the most respect for, because it is almost a selfless act of looking at everything before you, as we've talked about before, paying so much respect to it because you love it. It is this beautiful creation. Again, I keep saying beauty because I think it's such a perfect word for what we're talking about, and being able to move forward while respecting all of that stuff and being able to change with the dynamic expectations of what this industry brings you. And I think that is what I am interested in. And as I see some of my young contemporaries come up and absolutely love and hone in on that craft, I love it. I love what I'm seeing from young composers. I love what I'm seeing from my young artistic contemporaries who are doing things that are trying to break the boundaries of what we're doing. I respect all of it and I love all of it. But what I want for myself is for somebody to ask me a question and for me to have an answer, because at some point I've had my hand in every single pie that is being made, because if it's got my name on it, I want to be the person that's doing it.
Yeah.
And even if I'm not the person that is directly in charge of the work, John Williams didn't mix every score he's ever done. He didn't mix any of the scores he's ever done, but he knows how to get the orchestra to sound really good in the room, So I think working on those skills, I think, is so valuable, at least to me. And the time that I spent at Bleeding Fingers, the time that I've spent afterwards, and what I see in the industry both before and ahead of me, that's where I'd like to find myself in the craft versus art debate. I hope that next year I work on something or something releases or whatever, and somebody gives me a scathing review that says this is the most unartistic thing that I've ever listened to. Well, that's great. That means I'm right in line with what I'm kind of striving for with myself, which is I want to build a very, very solid craft-based foundation so that by the time I am asked to do something artistic, it's an expression not only of my artistic learnings over time, but also the craft that I have accrued over, at that point, maybe hopefully decades of work and learning. But that's where I currently stand on the art and craft debate. And so many people, this is, it doesn't matter. Like it absolutely doesn't matter. And I think there's room, and that's again the nice thing about it. There's room for both. There will
Yeah.
always be room for both, which is nice that I get to choose, what side of that fence, albeit a fence that doesn't even need to be made or called out, but I get to decide where I'd like to go, even though I don't get always decide what note I get to put on the page with my industry.
Yeah. Well, I still, with that in mind, I mean, I still love every bit of what you're saying, and I totally agree with you. And I that's why I was hoping you would talk more about it,
Yeah.
because that's what I was wondering about is, how do these two things fit together? That's something I think about constantly. And, speaking personally, at my core, I want to be an artist with the music I make, but I know that that will only get me so far
Right.
without a foundation of craftsmanship. And so striking that balance is, I think, a lot of amazing composers think about that, and their music is amazing for that reason. I
Yeah.
think a lot of amazing composers don't think about it and rely a lot on artistry, and that's
Absolutely.
great. But yeah, I don't know. I think a mix of both. That's when I start thinking about the long game. Like, I want to be doing
Absolutely.
this. I want to be doing this when I'm like 93 years old, like John Williams.
Yeah. I mean, that's the purpose of having conversations like this, and well, both with you and also with myself in my solitude. Is just kind of, well, let's think about the long game. What do I want from myself? And it's interesting too. I say that this doesn't matter. This not this conversation, but the I guess rather didactic separation that I have just created does or doesn't matter. I only say that because I think this is a whole nother point, but music, I believe, is for the listener. And that's a difficult thing. And again, another very dividing comment. I'm sure I've made a few and will continue to do so maybe, but I think that music is best when it can be shared with as many people as possible, when it can be commonly appreciated. I mean, the way we started this conversation was, well, I gave basic answers on what scores I really like. Well, it's because the scores reach so many people,
Yeah.
and I think that's the goal for me, at least, is to be widely appreciated or noticed or thought of when it comes to a certain style of music, or that kind of thing, because I think that I'm doing my job as, in my opinion, I'm doing a job as a creative, creating something that changes other people. That's the goal for me, and to have fun while I'm doing it. We're talking more and more about this. I think maybe you're uncovering for you and the viewers maybe what my pillars are. Maybe they'll have a better answer for me after listening to this podcast on what my pillars might be.
Yeah. Well, I'm
Um,
glad to hear that I'm doing my journalistic
yeah,
job
I love it.
as a
I mean,
non-journalist.
these are wonderful questions, but also just, again, having these kind of conversations with you, let alone another composer, is just so,
Yeah.
it's great. It's great.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I get to do this a lot, so now
Yeah.
you know why.
Well, keep them coming. I have all night. I'm not doing anything. So
Well, yeah, one of the things that I ask everyone else, and that, you've given some great examples so far, but I'll ask you more directly. But what is a piece of music or a song, a book, a piece of art, any kind of, I guess, artistic artifact that changed the way that you thought about your work, maybe even changed your life, if we're going to be more dramatic about it?
I mean, I already gave the Jurassic Park example. I guess I definitely have another or a few others, but I will come back to the Jurassic Park thing just to give an example of how literally it changed my life. I loved dinosaurs as a kid. That's why I like Jurassic Park. I listened to the music and I was like, wow, the music's really great. And then didn't really think much. Well, I did. I thought about it constantly, but that was kind of the extent of it at that time. I didn't really learn music appreciation until later. Now, the high school when I was in elementary school, Pogue elementary school, call out. But when I was at Pogue, the high school orchestra, directed at the time, I believe, by Dan Boyer, came over and played the Jurassic Park theme, and I freaked out. I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is it! That's something that I'd love to. I want to play strings
Yeah.
because I see now that it is possible." And they played Jurassic Park. I totally freaked out. And so literally it was something that was kind of ever present as a decision maker for me going forward. So by the time it was time to sign up for electives, I was like, all right, well, Jurassic Park, I love it. And the orchestra performed it. So I would get to play Jurassic Park if I'm in an orchestra. And then my mom was like, well, but I want you to be a drummer. Again, the whole rhythm thing. She was like, I want you to be a drummer. So maybe you should sign up for band. See, and I was like, well, I mean, I guess all the best lines in Jurassic Park are played by trumpet. So I want to play trumpet. So I joined band last second. Well, good old Roger Doss needed saxophones, didn't put me on trumpet. And I'm still bitter to this day, Roger, even though it's gotten me this far. But he puts me on saxophone. But we read Jurassic Park. We sight read Jurassic Park. I think it was towards the end of my either 7th or 8th grade year as kind of a, okay, Austin, like, yes, we'll read through Jurassic Park.
Nice.
And again, it was just incredible. It was like, oh my gosh, look at this. Now I'm making Jurassic Park with this is exactly what I wanted in elementary school, So then going on to saxophone was what got me into college and all that kind of stuff. But I always loved the orchestra. And, we've talked about this. They'll get sick of hearing me say this. We didn't have as we didn't have a string program at Moorhead. So the first time I heard an orchestra really and kind of recognized what was happening, because of course I might have when I was a bit younger, was the Cave Run Symphony Orchestra in Moorhead. I was like, wow, this is so cool. And it's a semi-professional orchestra. Again, with now we can call them colleagues, but the former professors of ours and all of this. So it's a great orchestra.
And it did not even exist when I was
It didn't. It
so,
didn't.
Yeah, this is recent.
It came about, and I interned with them and did string bowings for Sue Ann Blair, copied all of her string bowings to all of the is wild. I'm sure you remember Sue Ann Blair.
Yeah.
Who wouldn't? But yeah, and I believe now this one I don't have great recollection of, but I think they also played. I know they played music of Star Wars, but I think they also played Jurassic Park on a film music concert, and I was like, wow, this is just incredible. And then later on, Matt Taylor brought us to, saxophone. We did a tour in Miami for I think it was the MTNA competition. Our quartet was doing a tour. And Matt used to be one of the on-call guys for saxophone for the New World Symphony. So we sat in with them, and they played a piece. And again, I'm trailing together breadcrumbs of a story here, a common trend. I'm sure people know by now this deep into the podcast. But they played Hindemith's Symphonic Metamorphosis, which I had never heard. And certainly up to that point, I had never heard an orchestra of that quality, of that stature, especially performing such a great work. I heard them play that piece and then rehearse the piece, which, again, the first time I've ever seen an orchestra rehearse, completely changed the way that I thought about orchestration, that I thought about writing, because I hadn't written for strings at that point, because again we didn't have a string program. So it kind of shifted everything for me. It kind of opened up this world of composition as I had thought of it, maybe very narrowly, film music and wind band music. That was all I was kind of, and then the world of orchestra music in a way that was tangible, a lot more tangible, watching rehearsals and that kind of thing. It really opened my mind to kind of to every approach. I mean, I think my vocabulary tends to narrow when I think about or try to express things that I'm very passionate or care a lot about. Simple vocabulary sometimes is maybe just the best to get across a point. But yeah, I don't know. I was kind of in awe of that. And fast forward a few years, but that shift in focus in the way that I think about orchestration and like looking at the scores and trying to figure out what is going on. I watched a YouTube video of the score for the Symphonic Metamorphosis, specifically the last movement. Listening to that, looking at the score follow along on YouTube, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is just fascinating." But also realizing it wasn't that complicated. The parts are not that complicated. I was just I have an intern doing a little bit of shadowing and work and experience for me, and we were talking specifically about this of looking at something that sounds so complicated and that you love so much, and then realizing that it actually is not that complicated, and that's kind of the beauty in it. I'm looking here again, getting over COVID. I'm looking here at my, what is it? My cough drops, my menthol cough drops, and a copy of the piano reduction of Copland's Rodeo or Rodeo, or different people pronounce it different ways, but Hoedown from Aaron Copland. And it's like, wow, this is not that complicated, but it is so masterfully, craftfully done. It's
Right.
just, it's again, limited vocabulary when I get passionate. It's amazing. It's great. It's wonderful. It's beautiful. I mean, I say the same things over and over and over again. But anyway, the whole one piece changing your life thing, that change and shift of the way that I think about how I approach music informed how I wrote for orchestra for the first piece with strings for my application to the Frost School of Music, which got me into Frost, which then opened the door to working with an orchestra and having those kind of experiences, which further kind of attuned my skills and pointed me in the direction towards going to USC, which was a very specific, prescriptive at the time type of degree that was very focused in orchestral film music. And the first month, putting a cap on this breadcrumb story, the first month that I had moved to LA, wouldn't you know, the Los Angeles Philharmonic was doing a two-picture concert, which is where the orchestra plays the score
Mm.
along with the film
Yeah, right.
of Jurassic Park.
Oh, jeez.
And it was
It's
this
incredible.
beautiful, yeah, it was this beautiful full circle, very full circle moment to me that started with me loving dinosaurs as a kid and hearing a high school orchestra play Jurassic Park. So yeah, Jurassic Park, absolutely, that score fundamentally changed the way that the direction of my life, let alone how much I have studied that score and how that score has influenced my writing even on a daily basis. I mean, the journey to the island is one of my favorite cues, maybe of all time. But to an Easter egg for viewers as far as how something like this might be able to change your process, when you stop for a second to realize that the theme for Jurassic Park is really a choral church hymn
Mm.
that plays the first time you see a dinosaur in a movie that is about man playing God. It's a high concept film that at its core is about man playing God. I always get chills when I talk about this. What better a place for a church hymn than the first time man successfully plays God and you see a dinosaur on screen for the first time? I mean, these kind of results, when you hear great scores in this kind of thing, like these are the kind of thoughts that are shaping the lives of people you walk around with. John Williams was like, you know what? This is a good decision. This is a high concept film. Let's do this. It works perfectly. He gets away with it because he has a wonderful relationship with Steven Spielberg, and he trusts him. And then that impact of a film that I think came out before I was born. Jurassic Park was 93, 94.
93 or 94. Yeah.
Yeah. Completely changed the course of my life. So I speak about it very passionately. And while there are some other examples that I had listed in there, the symphonic metamorphosis,
Yeah.
of all of them, certainly Jurassic Park, if for no other reason that it has presented itself to me at such key pivotal moments in my life continuously. And, you know, what better a welcome to Los Angeles than welcome to Jurassic Park being the first thing you hear in front of you.
I mean, this is why I love doing this podcast and why I wanted to do this podcast is because we all have stories like that where,
Yeah,
of course hindsight's 2020 and it's, you make the decisions you make and it
of
leads
course.
you to today, but
Yeah.
you look back and it's like something that can happen when you're a small child
Mhm.
can have such a profound influence on everything that
Yeah.
happens afterwards. And,
Yeah.
especially what you're describing, where it's like, it's almost like little affirmations like, yes, you're doing the right thing.
Right.
You're in the right place at the right
Right.
time. And it just keeps nudging you along. I wonder what the next instance of Jurassic Park will be in your
Yeah, I
life.
mean, you never know, that of course is, certainly is a dream project of mine. I would love to do a Jurassic Park film. So who knows? Maybe 10, 15 years from now, I'm doing Jurassic Park 25, which would be wonderful. And I
Yeah.
will tell the same story again and again and again because it's this kind of serendipity is part of why I love this little adventure that we're on called life. I These kind of things, whether they do or do not, whether you believe or not believe that they happen for a reason, I find a lot of comfort in it. A lot of comfort in that.
Tyler here, interrupting this conversation just briefly to let you know that you can easily help power the Music Maker podcast and Loose Leaf Transmissions Network in a big time way by becoming a Patreon subscriber. By becoming a Patreon subscriber, you're supporting these fantastic conversations with makers in a real way. And one of the perks to being a subscriber is getting early access to episodes each week. And I've also launched a Patreon exclusive feature called The Workshop. It's sort of like an audio journal where I share a little bit about my own creative process as it pertains to some current composition projects that I'm working on. Anyway, yes, that little bit of support on the Patreon, in fact, does go a long way in helping me cover the cost of some tools that I use to produce this podcast. So I hope you'll consider becoming a subscriber by following the Patreon link in the show description of this episode, or you can log on to looseleaftransmissions.com/support. I really appreciate you getting back to me. And back to today's episode. So is there a project of yours that stands out as like a personal favorite or
Oh,
one that challenged you in unexpected ways? Those could be two totally
yeah,
different answers, I know.
yeah. Those are two, I think, very different answers. Certainly, one that challenged me in the ways that it kind of challenges everybody else was kind of the first big project that I worked on, which was the BBC documentary. Sadly, it didn't perform as well as maybe they had hoped. So there was no soundtrack release, which is always decided by the studio. It's a lot of politics. But I was 24 when I started working on a BBC documentary. That's wild. And being a 24-year-old looking at a grad student, just having graduated, I started at Bleeding Fingers in officially in July 20th, which, by the way, serendipity, July 20th was when I started Bleeding Fingers, exactly 1 year to the date I moved to Los Angeles, which is crazy.
Wow.
But yeah, so a year later, I landed my first gig. And then I think we started on that BBC show in September, or we pitched for it in September, and then we got the pitch later in that September. When you look at a body of work as large as you have to write 6 hours of music for this episodic nature documentary, it's terrifying. You don't know how you're going to do it. And this is a funny conversation that I have with some other friends of mine in the contemporary composition space. Is like 6 hours of music is wild.
That's like
Uh,
everything I've ever written.
it's a lot.
Yeah.
It's so much. I mean, I had mentioned with TV, you write 30 or 40 minutes of music in a week for TV. Which is you write and produce, record anyway. But that was kind of scary. And I had a wonderful group of people around me. The management on that project was, I think, a little bit difficult, as it goes. You don't always get a perfect hand, but we had a wonderful music supervisor, Marcia Bow. She's still working over at Bleeding Fingers, who kind of, a music supervisor's job is just to kind of like organize tasks. Your recording is going to be this date. Here are revisions from the client, that kind of stuff, to interface, pretty much interface and organize. My co-composer, Denise Santos, was incredible. She had so much more experience than I had doing that kind of stuff. We both, I think, grew very close. We were kind of strangers prior to that, but we both grew very close on that project just because it was a big thing. It was a lot of work. So how are we going to kind of really muscle our way through 6 hours of score? But it was a really cool exercise. Now, whenever I look back at it, it was a struggle, but most struggles are exercises, really, or most exercises are struggles. I say as I sit in this chair for the eighth day in a row, but it was an interesting exercise in repetition without, well, how should I say this? Replication without repetition,
Mm, yeah.
and also the limitations of what is actually possible. We did the first episode, and Denise and I pitched for the main theme for the show, and I got the pitch, even though I think her theme was far better than mine. I still remember hers. Actually, it's great, and that theme was one that I had built with in mind. Hey, if I get this pitch for the theme, there should be enough elements in this that I can kind of stretch out and see how much mileage I can get out of replication without repetition, right? So we did the first episode, and it was hard. Like I will not sit here and say that it was easy doing that much work, because for me at that time, and Denise and I split everything down the middle. So she did half, I did half. So at the time I for that first episode, I wrote 30 minutes of music. 30 minutes of music as a just having graduated grad student, that's still a
Mm.
big undertaking. Even when you
Oh yeah.
you parse down 6 hours, that's a lot. And after the first episode, I was like, oh, finally, that's over. And then episode two got the new cut. And it's like, wow, okay. You mean I have to do this again? All right. And it was interesting because what I found was was starting to explore the process of craft, the
Yeah.
process of looking at what I had done for the first episode, breaking it down almost as if it was another person's work, and sitting there on the piano and being like, oh, okay, so that's really what I was doing. I was approaching the first one in survival mode. Completely honestly, I'd like to say that I knew what I was doing. Of course, that's not the truth. I would even like to go further to say that I was in control of what I'm doing, because as we talked about, that's the more respectable way to look at this, the more truthful way to look at this. And honestly, looking back on it, I wasn't even in control of what I was doing per se. I had my blinders on, and I was in survival mode. So looking back at it as if it was work from another composer, in episode two, I approached it with a different kind of, a little bit of a more humble confidence, having realized how much I grew, but also recognizing too that if I completely didn't know what I was doing, if I was completely full of I wouldn't have been able to make it through the 30 minutes, the half of that
Right.
first episode. So I had to give myself a little bit of credit. And this is something that Denise and I talked about actively, And I think part of the reason why we grew close on that project was constantly we were calling each other and being like, "Hey, how are you doing today? Like, are you
Yeah. Just
good?"
checking in. Yeah.
Yeah. And more often than not, the answer was not always yes. It was, no, yeah, this is rough. Like, hey, this scene is really hard. I don't really know how I feel about it. We'd send stuff back and forth to each other and,
Mm.
get feedback. And, the way that she approached synths and writing over time, stretching out a single idea across a long period of time, was so inspiring to me. It still is. She's such a wonderful composer. Then she would turn around and be like, hey, your orchestration is something that I'm learning a lot from, because that's not what I'm thinking about when I write. So we really were able to learn from each other. That whole process was very, very informative on my craft, but also the process of collaboration, the process of having and working with a team, having a music supervisor like Marsha who was able to coach us in the right direction, not lead us, not guide us, but say, what do you need and how can I help? Well, if you need this, we might not have the resources to do this, but here are a few other options of what you can do. I mean, that kind of stuff was invaluable. So I think that process alone certainly shaped, the way that I kind of move forward in my own work. And it was my first big project. Of course, it was pivotal in, how I think and do things.
It's all just so fascinating to me, and I sat down with a composer who works in like the video game space too, and
Ah, yeah.
that's all I said to him the whole time was like, it's just fascinating to me, which is true. So
It's
I dig it.
it's still fascinating to me, even though I do it every day. I mean, there's not a day passes that I'm not learning something new about what I'm doing, and it certainly keeps you humble in a very good way. But yeah, video games. I mean, I've worked on one game. It's a whole nother world.
That's what I'm learning now, having sat
Oh,
down with both of you.
yeah. It's
Josh Mallard is the composer. I'll
uh,
give him a shout out.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
I will
episode
watch the episode.
episode 8, I think. Anyway, kind of getting into my final series of questions, starting with what do you think you would be doing if it wasn't making music? If your job was just something totally different.
If you ask 10-year-old me, it would be paleontology. Again, dinosaurs. I know too much. I know more than any self-respecting 28-year-old who's not a paleontologist should know about dinosaurs. So definitely paleontology is one of them. If you ask high school me, I did the AP test and all that stuff. I applied to go into biology, marine biology, I think specifically, because animals are living dinosaurs. If I can't get the dead ones,
Yeah,
I'll get the living ones,
sure.
I guess. So yeah, marine biology and animal biology, certainly. And I think now definitely video games, but not the music side of video games. Probably the art side or the story side of video games. I mean, I think, anybody who gets into my industry has some sort of affinity for storytelling. And that's something I'm sure, somebody should count the amount of times I've said story or drama in our conversation. But everybody gets into film because they want to tell a story. It doesn't matter what side you're on. And I think video games, in some ways, in a lot of ways, are the modern film, the modern, big thing that is able to get stories to multiple people. And it's funny because even Hollywood is realizing that with all of the video game remakes. And
Right.
I
Right.
mean, I'm such a fan of Halo. Halo is my bread and butter. You can't see it, but it is my background on my computer rig here. I have a little shrine over there of Master Chief and Halo paraphernalia. I dabbled in some cosplay, another creative
I
field
think I
that
remember that. Yeah.
yeah, you do remember that. Yeah. So I love Halo. And I think if there were anything, I guess, in particular that I could do, it would be working in some way for that company
Yeah.
doing Halo games. But the reason I bring it up is Hollywood realizing that they can make money off of video games, and Halo is maybe an infamous example. The TV show didn't necessarily go over that well, unfortunately. But The Last of Us uh, did very well. I know its next season is coming around here soon. So yeah, I think working in the video game space, not in music, but in story, I think would be so much fun.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
awesome. Is there a tool that you use in your practice that you think everyone should know about and that everyone else could benefit from? And this could be
Oh,
like from a film composer to like the rest of us who don't do that, or just a
yeah.
general tool for listeners who might do other types of art,
Mm.
whatever you want it to be.
I'll give a few different answers actually.
Yeah.
From a film composer to a film composer, if there are any listening, I have a touchscreen monitor in my setup. and CC data is something that you have to write a lot of. It's data for expression curves, volume curves, pitch bend curves, all that kind of stuff. And on my setup, I have this touchscreen so that I can have my MIDI window open and I can write in with a stylus my CC data, which saves a lot of time. Now, granted, it adds a little bit of time too, but it still gives you a net positive, net negative in the time that it saves you time. It saves you a
Yeah.
lot of time.
Yeah.
Saves you more time than it burns, even though you're spending a little bit more time in some other areas. Because I get exactly what I want out of the performance. It's almost like having a breath controller when you're playing a wind instrument into the DAW, but it's all by hand. Some may say that it's the same thing as like writing a fader or whatever. Yeah, it absolutely is. But I think what I like is that tactile. I'm writing music and I'm literally holding a pencil and I'm writing CC data. I like that. I like that a lot. I'm not just rubbing a fader back and forth. So that's definitely one from film composer to film composer. From film composer to contemporary composer, I think the technology of DAWs, digital audio workstations, has gotten to the point where more than likely you will be able to get your ideas out and polished faster if you're working into a DAW than you
Mm.
are into a notation software.
Yeah.
And that might be a hot take, because I know just as DAWs have taken off and that kind of thing, just as many workflows has evolved for contemporary composition, specifically with Sibelius and Rest in Peace Finale, Dorico, and all of this kind of stuff. But that said, I just was working with a contemporary composer friend of mine, Olivia Kiefer. She's wonderful,
Oh yeah.
and she was oh my gosh, Olivia?
Not direct. We've never met, but I know.
Yes,
I'm very familiar with her work.
she's great, and gosh, she writes such good music. But she's just such a joy to be around, like as a person. But we were taught, she was doing a film recently, and I was kind of walking her through the process of, if you want to do it in a DAW, you can do it this way. If you want to do it in a notation software, you can do it this way, but you have to think about XYZ, all these different things. Also, speaking of Olivia, a shout out to another friend of hers and also another contemporary composer friend of mine who I talk to about this kind of stuff often, Logan Rutledge, wonderful composer. When I was at Frost, one of few contemporary composers that I identified with, I guess, sonically. I really appreciated his music because his music was really trying to tell a story. It wasn't going to his recitals. It was sitting down and listening to good music and a story written by a wonderful human being, and not necessarily sitting down and listening to some of the others who shall not be named. But all of that to say, I do think for contemporary composers, and I see a lot more of it anyway, that exploring DAWs is just another way for artistic and creative, like craft expression, that might not be something that they look into or maybe are comfortable with. I see a lot of composers, like contemporary composers, using like these really, there's nothing wrong with it, but these really weird means of creating brand new sounds that you've never heard before. But like digital synthesis in a DAW is exactly that, and the ceiling is so much higher. Christy Milby is a really good example, I think, in all of her music. She's always kind of explored those interesting sounds,
Yeah.
and interesting soundscapes. Now, whether or not she's doing it in a DAW or outside of a DAW, I think the point still stands that it, is kind of an ever growing wealth of inspiration, especially when you're starting off with presets that are sounds that are, developed by people who that they do that and that's their whole job. So it's a good starting point, especially for like brand new sounds if you're working on, like Christy, electronic media music and accompanied by electronic music and that kind of thing. Okay, so now just like a person to person recommendation.
Well, you don't have to do that, but
Well, I'll do it.
I'll just spitball.
I'll do it. I'll do it anyway. To make it light and to not make it about music at all. Two things. One, there's a website that I use called Notion. I really like it
Oh,
for just organizing.
I just started using that for
It's great.
so many different things already.
It's so great. And like, yes, you could use Google Sheets, but then you kind of have to know about Google Sheets to use Google
Yeah.
Sheets, and like, yeah. So Notion's great. It's easy to use for everything. I
Yeah.
use it for my music stuff, sure, to do music organization or cue sheets and the like. But and then a very non-music, non-organizational example. I enjoy cooking. I think it's Weber. Yes, I think it's Weber has a New Orleans Cajun seasoning that has like I put it on everything, and it's good. It's not even overly Cajun-y, but
Yeah.
it's just like if I am just cooking something fast, because I don't know about you, but oftentimes I don't make enough time again, having and making enough time, different things. I don't make enough time to cook for myself, to cook
Yeah.
well for myself. So if I'm just like making something and I want it to taste like really good, this is not a Weber sponsored ad, but yeah, Weber New Orleans Cajun it's just a really good spice.
Yeah. I'm going to have to find that.
Yeah. I'll send you a picture. I'll send you a picture
Yeah,
afterwards.
please do. Please do. So my final question for you is, and to be fair, you've shared so much, so maybe you've already given me the answer.
We'll
But
see.
what is something that you've never had a chance to say about your art that you've always wanted to share with people?
I think this industry and this job and especially, look, we've talked for I don't even know how many hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. It all can be said so simply. It all can be expressed with such a smile on my face. That is not that is so far from the truth of what I experience on the daily. I mean, here we are in a very elated state because we're talking to each other for the first time in years about something we've been doing
Yeah.
for years and that kind of thing. But you know, I had COVID this past weekend, and I was terrified I was going to miss the deadline for this soundtrack release. I mean, I still might, but no, I won't. Most of it is struggle, but I think all of the struggle is worth it. I mean, it has to be worth it. You know, again, I choose to believe that it has to be worth it at some point. At somewhere down the yellow brick road, it just gets better. Not to say that it's terrible now. So on the flip side of that, just because I'm also expressing that, man, yeah, it sucks most of the time, blah 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 blah. No, it's pretty good sometimes. And I think the importance of saying this, I was just talking with a director friend of mine, Elisa Catalina, a wonderfully talented director. I've worked with her on a lot of stuff. She just got into a writing fellowship, and we were talking about congratulating it and all of this kind of stuff. And we were talking about the ups and the downs and the interesting people who have reached out and all these different things. And one of the things that I told her, I was like, look, this too shall pass. And it's such basic
Yeah.
advice, but I think it can't go without bringing it up. All of the good things that I've shared in this podcast have passed, and they were great. All of the negative things that I'm not sharing, just because there wasn't necessarily an opportunity to share them. Well, those also were terrible, but they too passed. The good passes, the bad passes. I think the important thing, and what I try to remind myself, and I'm not great at doing that, is to just be kind, to be as kind as I can to myself, so that way you can just make it, day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, whatever it is, and celebrate the wins, celebrate the losses, celebrate the bad days and the good days, because after a good day, a bad day could come just as easily as another good day. So I think it is very, very important to share that, because something we didn't talk all that much about, and I'm sure we could have talked about it for another hour, but mental health is so important. And I think we've had our period of time where everybody has been, for lack of a better term, woke, and everybody's talking about issues that really do matter. But just because you stop talking about them doesn't mean that they go away and those issues are fixed. Just because, a hard lesson for me, just because Black Lives Matter was a thing and I was hired at Bleeding Fingers for being perfectly qualified, but also for being black, doesn't mean that I'm never going to experience racism in this industry or any type of racial bias or, that's not fixed. And just because we have talked very healthily for the past few years about mental health doesn't mean that it just gets fixed.
Right.
Uh, I will mention this in relation to what we're talking about and the topic that now I've kind of presented. Last year I lost my grandmother, who my mom and my grandma raised me, and that was maybe one of the hardest. This past year has been one of the hardest and one of the most rewarding years of my life ever. But the difficult part was the mental health. You lose. I mean, almost a parent. She's a grandparent, but you lose somebody that's that close to you, and yeah, it does a toll on you. But you still have to deliver your projects. You still have to go to work every day. You still have to, show up with a smile on your face to a meeting. I mean, you don't get to use that as an excuse. That doesn't mean you don't still have to turn around and deal with it behind closed doors by yourself, with your friends, with, whatever, whoever your circles are. Mental health is so incredibly important to being able to continue and persist in doing what we do every day. Being a creative means laying your heart and your mind out every single day, and that's exhausting. That alone is gonna put a spin on your mental health for sure.
Oh yeah.
Let alone what we've taught, all the things that we've been talking about. I mean, playing the long game,
Yeah.
worrying about that and how that affects your mental health. The word just, and this I think I will use to put a cap on this topic and this question. But something I focus on is just XYZ. Doesn't matter what it is, but approaching things with not lackadaisical, not like I don't care, but just being content with whatever the outcome is, whether the outcome is current or in the future or in the past or whatever. So that way it kind of lets me just approach everything with the same level of self. And it's been a very healthy approach. Doesn't mean it's perfect. I have terrible, terrible mental health days. I mean, everybody does. But mental health is just as important as physical health. And my girlfriend reminds me of how important physical health is, and I don't take that as seriously as I should. So, but all of that said, we've spoken for nearly 4 hours, and I think mental health is something that I glossed over perhaps a bit too much. So I do want to just bring it up, if for no other reason than to have a conversation on why I gloss over it. And it is something that I think about and deal with and try to be healthy about every day. So it's normal to me, but it's so important. It is so important. It's important for it to be, I think, seen as normal and something that can be talked about like this. And again, I'll repeat it, just because it's something that we have openly talked about as a society and that kind of stuff doesn't mean it's fixed.
Yeah.
Just because we talk for 4 hours and we don't really talk about mental health doesn't mean I don't deal with terrible mental health. I do it all the time.
Of course. Yeah.
But I celebrate the wins when I have them, and I celebrate the loses because that means I'm learning. And with that, I will say, Tyler, thank you so much for having me on this, because I think talking talking at you for for the past 3 hours, I mean, has been rewarding for me in my own way of self-reflection, which is kind of
Yeah.
the way that we started off this entire podcast, was talking about self-reflecting. And so these opportunities are hopefully as great for me as they might be your viewers, and listening to a perspective, because it's not that often that I sit down and really think about the questions that you're asking me in a way that I get to hear myself either bull a really good sounding answer, or just speak from the heart and get to say the way I feel and think every day. So I can't thank you enough for this opportunity, man. And I'm so glad that it's coming from somebody. And I mentioned this in an email, coming from somebody who absolutely was an inspiration for me when I was at Moorhead. You and Christy Milby were the two people before me that were studying music composition in a place that we should not have done so.
Yeah.
And all three of us, in our own respects, have been successful after studying at, a place that didn't have a composition degree. So I have you to thank also for my success, because you have to have people ahead of you who are constantly inspiring you to do that. And whether you knew it or not, you absolutely were one of those people. So it has been an honor to sit here and share, 3.5 hours of your time.
Oh man, I don't know what to say other than thank you. That means
simple vocabulary. Simple vocabulary.
And yeah, certainly it's been really great getting to know you better. And that's another reason I asked you on. Both of us, District 8, Kentucky,
yes,
Moorhead Pipeline, and then as I said at the beginning, kind of forked off from there. So, Austin, thank you so much, and for your time today. And we're gonna have to do this again. I think,
absolutely.
That's the only way.
We'll circle back on that. Two composers. What did we say? Note for note.
Note for note.
But yeah, we'll circle back on that. Give us a few months. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
But awesome, man. Thank you so much.
Austin and I truly did meet up for 4 hours to record this episode, and quite honestly, I feel like we could have easily kept talking shop for another 4 hours or really just an entire day. There's just so much to learn about the world he operates within, even though it's still just composing music. I do hope you'll check out Austin's work by visiting his website. That's austinhammonds.com, and you can also see if you've watched any of the movies or TV shows he's worked on. He's got quite the comprehensive list there. I'm Tyler Kline, and thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. Music Maker with Tyler Kline is a production of Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears. We are online at looseleaftransmissions.com, where you can find more episodes of the podcast and ways to support the podcast and network. That'll do it for my time here with you today, and also that wraps up Season 1 of Music Maker. So truly, thank you so much for listening, and please give us a follow on social media. You can find us at Loose Leaf Transmissions to find out when Season 2 releases in 2025. And until then, do take care.